Okay, Hades' daughter, Chapter 2. Langarlia, southeast Britain. The land was ancient, scarred by the traverse of glaciers, oceanic inundations, and most recently, the axes and awls of humankind. Most of the island's forests had fallen victim to needs of men and women. In the past 1,000 years, 100 million trees had fallen, leaving vast wind-swept moors where once had been thick forests, and meadowlands where once had flowered dense thickets. Even if the island had lost its enveloping vast canopy, then there still remained great swaths of green forest that ran through the land like the ancient mystical roads of the gods. In these dark, strange woodlands, ancient riddles gathered in the twilight shadows, and murderous giant badgers and gray wolves and brown bears roamed paths rarely trod by human feet. Here, sprites and imps lived and died, and history itself sank deep beneath the virulent leaf waste that gathered at the base of twisted, prehistoric trees. Save for those especially marked by the gods, the human population left the forests and woods well enough alone. They worshipped the great stag god Og, who sheltered within the trees' shadows, venerating him with song and dance and sacrifice, but spent their lives amid the sunlit meadows and fields their braver ancestors had carved out of the Neolithic groves. Here, hares and hedgehogs, robins and larks, gambled, lesser and far more manageable creatures than their forest counterparts, and no threat to the herds of domesticated cattle, sheep, and pigs kept to feed the village populations of the land. In the southeast of the island, a green and verdant land, where the forests were fewer and the fields richer than elsewhere, dwelt the people of Langarlia. The Langarlians centered their lives, their culture, and their religion about the great river Lan that wound its languid and peaceful way through the southern central parts of the island to its mouth on the eastern coast. As the forests were the home of the stag god Og, so the Lan and its tributaries, lakes, and springs were the home of the great mother goddess Madge, under whose benefices the Langarlians grew their crops, bred their livestock, and raised the strong-limbed children that graced their hearts and homes. Langarlia basked in the union between Og and Madge, and in the marriage of forest and water. To the south of the Lan lay the fields and villages of the Langarlians, but on the northern bank of the river spread a series of wild and mystic hills and mounds that the Langarlians called the Veiled Hills, after the mist that often enclosed them. These hills and mounds were the sacred heart of Langarlia, resting as they did between the dark forest that spread to their north and west, and the river to the south. Here, amid the veiled hills, the ordinary people of Langarlia walked only during holy festivals, when their footsteps were directed and protected by the Magellan, the living representative of Madge, and the Gormagog, the living representative of Og. Between them, the Magellan and the Gormagog guided the spiritual lives of the Langarlians and the physical health of the land, personifying as they did the holy marriage between Madge, the waters, and Og, the forests. For the past 1,500 years, ever since the Langarlians had replaced those strange forgotten people who had built the stone dances, this union had been one of great soundness. The Langarlians had lived in health and peace, the men reaping the wealth of field and river, while the women bred children of exquisite beauty and well-being, the most elderly and respected mothers among the women of the land presiding over the houses or families. Now, however, a blight had fallen over the land. It had begun one dreadful night 26 years previously when the Gormagog, Arni, had lain with his own 13-year-old daughter, Blangan. In itself, this was not particularly unusual, for many mothers asked the Gormagog to lie with their daughters and get children of exceptional beauty and power on them. But on this occasion, the sexual act turned into a cataclysmic disaster. In that instant, the Gormagog split his seed into Blangan. He felt his Og power torn apart. Half of it he managed to retain. Half vanished into the sun he had planted within Blangan's womb. Divided, the Og power had become virtually useless. There was no point in even trying to abort the child. The damage was done. It was a disaster, not only for the Gormagog, as also for his son, but also for the god Og. As Gormagog was crippled, so also was Og. With every year that passed, Og weakened yet further, and as he weakened, so his union with Madge, which kept the land healthy and productive, also waned. There was nothing that could be done about it. No means existed to reunify the Og power now divided between Arni and his son, Loth. If Loth had been a daughter, it was conceivable that Arni could then have lain with his daughter, and granddaughter, as she would have been, when she came of age, and the son thus produced could have reunited the Og power into one body. But Gormagog had planted a son into Blangan. A son. A useless son. For all of Madge's power, and the power of the Magellan, the land itself began to wither and die. Cattle and sheep birthed thin, deformed offspring. Crops tended more to failure than to bounty, and the winters extended well past their allotted span, so that miserable sleet and destructive frosts afflicted the land even in the height of summer. The daughters of Langarlia, who traditionally had enjoyed healthy pregnancies and easy labors, now began to miscarry, and worse, die during childbirth. Even if both mother and child survived the perils of childbed, the infants often perished in the first few months of life, and their mothers proved barren on further children. Older children fell victim to strange fevers or unexplainable wasting diseases. The dark creatures of the forests, the wolves and bears and the monstrous badgers, strayed from beneath the trees and into the fields and the sheep runs of the village, not only destroying crops and hard-bred livestock, but mauling and ravaging adults and children alike. Langarlia was dying, and the powerless Gormagog and his equally powerless and angry shadow, Loth, could do nothing. Og was sliding toward death, and as he did, he dragged Madge with him. Unaffected as Madge was by the initial splitting of power when Arni lay with Blangan, as her union with her crippled Og failed, so also did Madge's power wane. Madge could do nothing for the land without a strong mate at her side. Then, in the 26th year of the calamity, the Magellan, Genovesa, daughter of the Magellan, who had presided over the disaster, and sister to Blangan, spoke to the Gormagog and to Loth, and said that she thought she could help. She spoke long and gently to them over many weeks, knowing they would resist her plan, knowing it would offend their male pride, but knowing that eventually they would also agree, for in this they had no choice. Langarlia must survive before all else. They sat atop the most sacred of the veiled hills, the Landen. It was dawn, the time when minds were the clearest and the power of the land was the nearest. "Why?" said Loth, leaning forward, his dark green and faintly luminous eyes unblinking and intent. "Why must you do this?" The Magellan Genovesa regarded him calmly. Loth's malformed, horrific skull was scratched deeply in places, the blood scabbing into unbecoming lumps in his thin hair, and Genovesa idly wondered which daughter of which house had so marked him. It must have been a wild night. As impotent as the Gormagog and Loth might have been in their ways of power, their maleness had not suffered when it came to bedding the daughters of Lengarlia. It was almost as if they both somehow hoped to redeem that one malevolent bedding with each subsequent girl they bore down beneath them. It was a useless effort, but Genovesa understood their need. She was also a recipient of it herself, having borne Arnie 3 daughters over the past 16 years. "There is the why," she said to Loth, waving a hand toward the settlements south of the land. "This season, over 11 daughters have died in childbirth. Barely half of the livestock born will grow into maturity, and 1/3 of the crops has fallen to the mold blight. Can you help, Loth?" It was cruel, she knew, but the need was great, and if she didn't persuade them soon, then the chance would pass her by. Loth's lip curled, and he sat back, wondering if Genovesa had a sneer behind her beautiful, serene face. His feelings for Genovesa were a mass of conflicting emotions. He resented and desired her, reasonable reactions given her power compared with his relative lack of it, and her beautiful, seductive body that often had him sweating with frustrated desire. But Loth also deeply distrusted Genovesa, and yet he could not say why. Unable to hold Genovesa's even gaze, Loth looked at his father, Arnie, sitting hunched over his belly, as if his impotency in the face of this crisis might send him to his grave. "We should take this to an assembly," Arnie said. His voice was soft, but even if his spiritual and magical powers had diminished into infirmity, his voice still held a vestige of traditional authority. "The mothers of Lengaria's houses should meet on this." He hesitated, and all remaining remnants of authority evaporated. "Shouldn't they?" "The mothers are not due to assemble again till Slaughter Festival," Genovesa said, remembering how powerful Arnie had been when she'd been a child. Now all that power had seeped away, along with his decisiveness, and Genovesa's respect had vanished with it. He'd fathered 3 daughters on her, but their beauty and power was all from her, not him. He had merely planted the seed. "That is almost a full year away. We cannot wait." "We could call an extraordinary assembly," said Loth, insistent where his father hesitated, and wondering why it was that Genovesa did not call an assembly. Sure, her plan demanded the consultation of the mothers. Why didn't she want to call them? Arnie looked at his son, and something he saw in Loth's face made his back straighten. "We could indeed," he said. The skin around Genovese's eyes tightened momentarily. Then she smiled, leaned forward, and put a warm hand on Arnie's bare thigh. The moment made the material of her soft linen robe strain against her breasts and hips, accentuating both her sexuality and her success as a mother. And Loth, watching Arnie carefully, was appalled to see his father's eyes actually water with desire. "Arnie," she said, her voice soft, persuasive, compelling, "would it not be best to delay a consultation with the mothers? Then we can see if my plan works. Why get their hopes up with an assembly now? We should wait. Wait until we are sure of my plan's success. Then we can put it to the Slaughter Festival assembly." "When we are sure." Her hand tightened, gripping Arnie's slack-aged flesh, and Loth looked away, sickened. "Strange magic," he said, spitting the words out as if they were pig filth. Genovese's plan repelled him, but only if he was honest with himself. because its very existence highlighted his own inadequacies. What need have we of foreign magic? Every need, Loth. Genovesa straightened, lifting her hand from Arnie's thigh. She looked at Loth, her demeanor exuding certainty, powered with a little impatience, as if Loth himself were the cause of the land's troubles. Then again, Loth thought, there was every chance that it was Genovesa did think she had ever been impatient with him. If only Loth didn't exist. If only he hadn't been convinced that fateful night. Then Gormagog's power would remain intact, and Langarlia would never have been overcome with blight. Loth could imagine the words repeating themselves over and over in Genovesa's mind. Loth had no idea how wrong he was. Og is impotent, perhaps even dying, Genovesa continued. We need a strong male magic to counter his lack and to combine with my womanly mage power to weave a web of protection once more over this land. I know where I can find this maleness, this potency. There, the cruel word was said. Genovesa saw Arnie's face flinch, and Loth's set into mottled-cheeked animosity. But she steeled herself against their hurt. What she did was for her foremothers, from whom she had inherited her strange exotic dark craft and even darker ambition. Og's power may revive, Loth began. Og's power has failed to revive in these past 26 years, Loth. How can you say, wait a little longer? We must act now, or our land will die. I can bring that magic to Langarlia, no one else. Genovesa looked to Arnie, and he nodded, his face resigned. If we must, Genovesa, if we must. We must, she said. Madge demands it. She needs a mate of potency, not what she must endure now. She paused, looking between both men. The Madge is strong in my womb, she continued, referring to the Madge magic that resided in every Langarlian woman's womb, but which flowered at its brightest in hers. I can act. I can save this land. How can you think to prevent me? Loth opened his mouth to speak, but his father silenced him with a heavy hand on the younger man's arm. Then do it, Genovesa, Arnie said, his voice thick with self-loathing. Do it. Bring your strange magic here, and use it in a spell weaving that will save us. Do it. Genovesa smiled, thankful Arnie had summoned enough authority to override his son's suspicions. Eventually, of course, she would have to do something about Loth. And thus ends Chapter 2. Ta-ta!